So a very warm welcome to each of you gathered here in the Aula Magna of the Pontifical Gregorian University, as well as to the many who are joining us online from around the world, literally from around the world. Just 4 days ago, during his Jubilee audience entitled "To Hope is to Take a Stand," Pope Leo XIV referred to Dorothy Day, and I quote, as a small, great American woman, a woman who had fire inside her and who was willing to take a stand in the face of society's inequalities. Dorothy Day was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1897, and her early years were marked by upheaval, including her family's experience of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. As a young woman later in life in New York, she immersed herself in the world of social activism, advocating tirelessly for workers and for women. The demonstrations and hunger strikes of those early years already reveal her deep resolve to take a stand and to bear personal cost for the sake of justice. In the 1920s, her life underwent a profound transformation with the birth of her daughter, Tamar Teresa, and her conversion to Catholicism. Events that reshaped her vocation and life's commitment. In 1932, she met Peter Maurin, whose vision helped inspire the founding of the Catholic worker movement. And what became, as a modest newspaper, soon expanded into houses of hospitality that embodied radical welcome and solidarity with the poor. Dorothy Day's life was marked by courageous consistency and a relentless pursuit of authenticity. She championed peace. Her commitment to justice drew her to support farm workers, migrants, interracial communities in the South of the United States, and all whose dignity was at risk. She traveled widely, even visiting Mother Teresa in Calcutta. She took a stand when she came to Rome in the autumn of 1965 to join in a 10-day fast with a group of women, praying that the Second Vatican Council would condemn nuclear arms. When Dorothy Day died in 1980, she left behind not only a movement, but a spiritual and a moral legacy grounded in faith, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to peace. Today, her life continues to invite us to imagine a world shaped not by fear or indifference, but by hospitality, courage, authenticity, and love for the poor. Her writings include 6 books, among them the classic spiritual autobiography, The Long Loneliness. I can still remember the moment I read that the first time. In addition, her letters, diaries, newspaper columns, and essays have been edited over the years, and they provide a rich resource for mining her spirituality and understanding of her social action. So the aim of this colloquium is to consider the significance, originality, and limitations of her legacy. The legacy includes not only what she wrote, but also what she did during her life. We look forward to hearing from distinguished scholars who will guide us in exploring the spirituality and social action of this extraordinary 20th century Catholic laywoman. The Department of Moral Theology and Spiritual Theology of this university is especially grateful for the opportunity to co-sponsor this academic colloquium with the University of Notre Dame, Rome, and with Manhattan University. And we also acknowledge with great appreciation our partners, the Dorothy Day Guild and the Lay Center at Foy Unitas. And finally, we express our gratitude to the rector of the Pontifical Gregorian University, Father Mark Lewis, for taking the time from his busy schedule to offer this institutional welcome, which will take place after our opening prayer, which will be led by members of the Lay Center, an academic community of lay women and men here in Rome. So I invite the Lay Center to come and lead us in prayer.
If you remain in me and my words remain in you, then you will ask for anything you wish, and you shall have it. My Father's glory is shown by your bearing much fruit, and in this way you become my disciples. I love you just as the Father loves me. Remain in my love.
The greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart. A revolution which has to start with each one of us. When we begin to take the lowest place, to wash the feet of others, to love our brothers and sisters with that burning love, that passion which has led to the cross, then we can truly say, "Now I have begun."
Caritas, confirmet
Father Lewis to the podium, our rector.
I'd first like to greet the co-sponsors, University of Notre Dame Rome and Manhattan University, and to thank also the Guild of Dorothy Day and the Lay Center for their efforts in putting this symposium together. To the family of Dorothy Day, to the panelists, esteemed guests, faculty, students, friends all, I'm very pleased to greet you in the name of the Pontifical Gregorian University and to welcome you to this symposium, a pilgrim of hope, a symposium on the legacy of Dorothy Day. As you all well know, Dorothy Day is an interesting figure, perceived as many as a radical at the margins of the church of her day. She might also be considered one of the most important figures in the history of the church in the United States. When we hear or use the word radical, we often think of something inherently uncomfortable, something that will force us to make sacrifices or to not enjoy something that we enjoy. But if we look at the word itself, it comes from the same word as roots, to seek the deepest part of our identity, of who we are, in our relationship, especially with God and our neighbor. For the church, radical means finding Jesus through the scriptures and the faces of those we encounter. We are all supposed to do this, but often we are caught in the branches instead of the roots of our faith. That sometimes makes us uncomfortable. Dorothy Day was radical in her spirituality, her simplicity of finding prayer. Her relationship with God was deepened through that prayer. She was a radical in her social action because she also found Jesus in that work. Caring for the poor, for the exploited worker, caring for the least in our world meant caring for Jesus. Dorothy Day was a radical person. She had a strong personality and a strong discipline, not easy to compromise, not afraid to confront or to protest. Because that was what she felt called to do and to be. Each of us are called to be responsible for our neighbors. What does that mean for each one of us? I suspect each one of us might respond a bit differently to what God asks of our capacities and our character. We are called to moments of encounter with Christ in our world, and we should not remain passive when we are called to action. Reflecting on the legacy of Dorothy Day should lead us to have hope for ourselves. Hope that we can be responsible and act when it is necessary and when it is in our capacity. That we can find a way of living that is also rooted deeply in our relationship with God. But I'm not here to preach or to be among the experts. I'm here to greet you. Just someone who tries to explain Dorothy Day to my students in the U.S. church history class that I'm privileged to teach. I suspect that Dorothy Day would not want to listen much more from me, but would rather let you get on with it. So again, welcome to the Gregorian. Thank you for this act of reflection. May it bear good fruit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Rector, for that beautiful introduction. And with that, I will turn this over to the first moderator, who is Dr. Felipe Dominguez, who's a journalist and director of the Lay Center, and he holds a doctorate in social sciences from this university, where he also teaches communications. He's the author of the book Selflessness in the Age of Selfies: What Young People Can Teach Us About Social Media's Throwaway Culture. So, Dr. Dominguez.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna, and good afternoon to all of you who are here today. Good morning or good evening to those who are following us online. Thank you for the generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and also with some members of the Lay Center community whom I would also like to thank for the beautiful opening prayer. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Lay Center, it's just an international academic and spiritual community of lay people based here in Rome. We can talk more about that on the break. We are really happy to be partners in organizing this event and some of the follow-up meetings that will happen afterwards. My role here is just to help guide the conversation during this first panel, and I believe some of us in this room and also online have already had the opportunity to hear about Dorothy Day and perhaps even read some of her spiritual readings or memoirs, but may not have had the chance to engage in a deeper academic, intellectual reflection on her life and thought, and that is certainly true in my case. So for this reason, I'm truly grateful to the speakers who are here today with us. Each one of them will have about 20 minutes for their contribution, after which we hope to have some time for comments and questions. That said, I would like to now introduce our first speaker, Robert Ellsberg. Robert Ellsberg is the publisher of Orbis Books. He worked with Dorothy Day during the last 5 years of her life and served as managing editor of The Catholic Worker. He has edited 6 volumes of Day's writings, including her diaries and letters, and he served on the historical commission responsible for preparing her cause for canonization. So please join me in welcoming Robert Ellsberg.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me all right. I was told 15 minutes, so I can slow it down a little bit. Dorothy Day is rightly remembered as a courageous activist, the leader of a lay Catholic movement, the editor of a newspaper, who was frequently arrested for the cause of peace and justice. As Pope Francis said of her, her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, by her faith, and the example of the saints. No doubt her spirituality and life of activism were inspired by the example of many saints. This included St. Francis with his radical embrace of poverty and the poor, his commitment to nonviolence, his delight in creation, and his effort to hold himself and the church to the example of the poor man Jesus. In many ways, the Catholic Worker was suffused with Franciscan spirit. Then there was St. Benedict with his model of community as a school of charity, his motto of Pax, peace, his emphasis on hospitality, his joining of work and prayer. Dorothy herself became a Benedictine oblate. She also frequently cited the example of St. Teresa of Avila with her science of prayer, her evangelical poverty, her zeal and boldness as a woman reformer, even against the winds and tides she encountered in the church and society of her time. Dorothy spoke of these saints as friends and companions who had found a way to live a Christ-centered life and who challenged us to do the same. But in the light of her very active life in the world, it may be curious to discover her particular devotion to Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, a Carmelite nun who died in 1897, the same year as Dorothy's birth, at the age of 24 in a small convent in Normandy. At first glance, these two women, the activist and the contemplative, would appear to have little in common. Dorothy's devotion to the little flower, as St. Therese is popularly known, is all the more striking in light of her initial reaction. Upon first reading Therese's autobiography, which she received from a priest soon after her conversion, she found it, quote, colorless, monotonous, too small, in fact, for my notice. In short, she said, pious pap. It took many years for her to change her mind. Quote, I much preferred to read about spectacular saints who were impossible to imitate, she wrote. And yet she would come to see in Therese not only a great saint, but one with a message of special relevance for our time. Therese had indicated a path to holiness that lay in performing all our daily tasks and duties in a spirit of love and in the presence of God. In this way, she believed, everyday life with its constant opportunities to exercise patience, forgiveness, and compassion, could become an arena for holiness. She called this path the little way. Thus, you didn't have to be in a convent or face lions in the Roman Colosseum here. Everyday life provided the means for sanctification. Furthermore, Teresa believed strongly in the spiritual connections that bind all members of the mystical body of Christ. Thus, each sacrifice endured in love, each work of mercy, did not just advance one's own path to holiness, they might increase the balance of love in the world. Dorothy embraced this principle and extended it to the social sphere. Each protest or witness for peace, though apparently foolish and ineffective, no more than a pebble in a pond, might send forth ripples that could transform the world. She wrote, "What you do here in New York helps those in China, India, South Africa, Europe, and Russia, as well as the oasis where you are. You may think you are alone, but we are members one of another. We are children of God together." Yet it took some while for Dorothy to appreciate and embrace Teresa's teaching. Commenting on her first response to Teresa's autobiography, Dorothy wrote, "What kind of a saint was this who felt that she had to practice heroic charity in eating what was put in front of her, in taking medicine, enduring cold and heat, enduring the society of mediocre souls, in following the strict regime of the convent of Carmelite nuns, which she had joined at the age of 15? What accounted for Dorothy's change of heart? The answer lay in her experience with the Catholic worker. Through years of living among the poor and unwanted, eating what was put in front of her, enduring not only cold and heat, but also the sights and smells of squalor and the company of so many wounded souls, she came to appreciate the power of Teresa's little way. Dorothy's diaries record the discipline of her spiritual life, daily mass, the rosary, rising early to read from Scripture, but they also record the constant discipline required to curb her anger and impatience and to practice charity in her dealings with those closest at hand. She did not have a placid disposition. One time someone advised Dorothy to hold her temper, and she replied, "I hold more temper in 1 minute than you will in your entire life." In her diary, she wrote, "I have a hard enough job to curb the anger in my own heart, which I sometimes even wake up with, go to sleep with, a giant to strive with, an ugliness, a sorrow to me, a mighty struggle to love. As long as there is any resentment, bitterness, lack of love in my own heart, I am powerless. God must help me." Her spiritual practice was deeply rooted in her daily examination of conscience, remembering failures of charity as well as insights or acts of kindness that reminded her of God. Thinking gloomily of the sins and shortcomings of others, she writes, "It suddenly came to me to remember my own offenses, just as heinous as those of others. If I concern myself with my own sins and lament them, if I remember my own failures and lapses, I will not be resentful of others." This was most cheering and lifted the load of gloom from my mind. It makes one unhappy to judge people and happy to love them. I was privileged to edit Dorothy's diary, to which I assigned the title, "The Duty of Delight." It's a phrase that appears first in the postscript to her autobiography, where she writes, "It is not easy always to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight." But she continued to repeat this phrase as a kind of mantra, often following a recital of miseries and challenges at the Catholic worker, the duty of delight. It served as a reminder to find God in all things, the sorrows of life as well as moments of consolation. Above all, it was a reminder of the choice and discipline required to respond with love to all circumstances and encounters. Anyone could feel delight when things were delightful. By the same token, it was very easy to love people who were lovable or who loved us in return. Living for so many years in a fractious community was a truly challenging task. But if we willed to love someone, if we willed to see Christ in them, we could do it, so she believed. That didn't mean it was any easier for her than it was for others. Yet it was the exercise of her faith in these small ways, in charity, forgiveness, patience, the daily endurance of what she called the pinpricks of community living, while striving, like Therese, to conduct her daily life in the conscious presence of God that equipped her for the extraordinary actions she performed on a wider stage. Here, too, the teachings of St. Therese came into play. In the 1950s, Dorothy engaged in a series of public acts of civil disobedience in the cause of peace. From the beginning of the Catholic worker, Dorothy had maintained a commitment to radical gospel nonviolence. In fact, it might be said that Dorothy Day played a prophetic role in recalling and attempting to live according to the peace message of Jesus. This position was in many ways the most radical and controversial aspect of her message. But for Dorothy, it was rooted in the same principle that underlay her practice of the works of mercy, the radical implications of the incarnation and the teachings of Christ. God in Jesus had entered into our humanity and our history so that what we did for others, for our brothers and sisters, whether feed them, shelter them, or bomb them, we did directly to him. In 1955, the US government introduced a civil defense program as part of Cold War preparations for nuclear war. In New York City, this meant that at the sound of a siren, everyone was required by law to take shelter, whether in basements or subway stations, or in the case of school children, under their desks. Dorothy was among a small group that refused to cooperate with these drills, instead sitting in City Hall Park and courting arrest. She did this every year for 6 years until the drills were stopped, regularly serving jail terms of 5 to 30 days. As Dorothy saw it, the illusion that nuclear war was survivable and therefore winnable made such a monstrous war more likely. To participate in such an exercise for doomsday, she believed, was an act of blasphemy. Her actions drew widespread scorn, if not ridicule. Yet she was not afraid of appearing foolish or becoming, as St. Paul said, a spectacle to the world. In contrast to those who professed realism and sanity while preparing for mass murder, she said, "We confess to being fools and wish that we were more so." It is significant that at the same time as her protests of the civil defense drills, Dorothy Day was actually writing a book about Therese. Her main point, as she described it to a friend, was to make people realize their personal responsibility, how everything they do matters. Quote, although many books had been written about St. Therese, she noted, quote, "The social implications of her teachings are yet to be written. The significance of our smallest acts, the significance of the little things we leave undone, the protests we do not make, we who are living in the world." In the Gospels, this principle was illustrated in the story of Jesus' multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Dorothy borrowed that phrase for the title of one of her books, in which she wrote, "One of the greatest evils of the day is the sense of futility. Young people say, what good can one person do? What is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. We can be responsible only for the action of the present moment, but we can beg for an increase of love in our hearts that will vitalize and transform all our individual actions, and know that God will take them and multiply them as Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes." It may be that Dorothy's application of St. Therese's little way to the social arena is one of the most significant and at the same time underappreciated aspects of her spirituality. Yes, Therese practiced her little way in the small enclosure of a Carmelite convent in Normandy, quote, "unknown to all the world," as Dorothy wrote. Yet she believed that Therese had a powerful message for those living in the world. Dorothy writes, "She speaks to our condition. Is the atom a little thing? And yet what havoc it has wrought. Is her little way a small contribution to the life of the Spirit? It has all the power of the spirit of Christianity behind it. It is an explosive force that can transform our lives and the life of the world once put into effect." In a world in which everything is measured by numbers, metrics, return on investment, it is hard to appreciate that there is another way of measuring value and success. But then how are we to understand Christ's words about the power hidden in a mustard seed? In a time when so many feel overwhelmed by the vast powers of this world, Dorothy bore witness to another power, the power disguised in what is apparently small and weak. Who can measure such power? Yet, as she noted, we know that one impulse of grace is of infinitely more power than a cobalt bomb. And as Therese in her dying words had said, everything is grace. In recent years, I was struck by the many things that Dorothy shared with Pope Francis, including this recognition of the value of small gestures and poor means. One of the Pope's favorite mottos was, "Time is greater than space." As he explained, this principle enables us to work slowly but surely without being obsessed with immediate results. Giving priority to time means being concerned about initiating processes rather than possessing spaces. Time governs spaces, illuminates them, and makes them links in a constantly expanding chain with no possibility of return. Compare that to today's words. What we do is very little, but it is like the little boy with a few loaves and fishes. Christ took that little and increased it. He will do the rest. What we do is so little we may seem to be constantly failing, but so did he fail. He met with apparent failure on the cross. But unless the seed fall into the earth and die, there's no harvest. And why must we see results? Our work is to sow. Another generation will be reaping the harvest. Of course, this had much bearing on Pope Francis's strategy for change, both in the church and in the world. Many people focus on seizing power, occupying space, but for the Pope, the key thing was planting seeds, initiating processes. What Dorothy called the revolution of the heart does not depend on seizing power or occupying space, but it initiates a process of change that may in the end prove more durable. She loved to quote a line from William James, who said, "I'm done with great things and big things, great institutions and big success, and I am for those tiny, invisible, molecular moral forces that work from individual to individual, creeping through the crannies of the world like so many rootlets, or like the capillary oozing of water, yet which, if you give them time, will rend the hardest monuments of man's pride." Saint Therese said that her vocation was love, to make love loved. And for Dorothy, love was ultimately the message of the gospel and the focus of her life, both in the intimacy of community life, in her practice of the works of mercy, and her activism in the world. Love, she liked to say, is the measure by which we will be judged. And so she prayed for the grace to, quote, "love with understanding and without understanding, to love blindly into folly, to see only what is lovable, to think only on these things, to see the best in everyone around, their virtues rather than their faults, to see Christ in them." This year marks the centenary of St. Therese's canonization in 1925, and Dorothy's cause for canonization is now in progress. If she is herself one day recognized as a saint, perhaps she will be seen as one of Therese's most ardent followers, in whose embrace of the vocation of love, the ways of the activist and the contemplative were joined. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, also for staying on time, but especially for your deep reflection on Dorothy Day, your life experience and relationship with her. For me, in a time marked by social media and artificial intelligence and relationships that increasingly develop in the digital environments, your words reminded of the idea that making an impact is not always about reaching a large audience or having a broad influence, but true impact is also depth. No, it's about going deeper, the capacity of going deeper. Pope Leo drawing from Augustinian tradition, has often spoken about the importance of helping people to cultivate their interior life, right? So that inner transformation may lead to renewal in the social and political spheres as well. So thank you for bringing us back to that essential point of Dorothy Day's life and thought. Our second speaker is Dr. Margaret File. She holds a joint appointment in the theology department and in the Institute for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. She is a faculty fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Claw Institute for Civil and Human Rights, and the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Her research interests include Catholic social thought, racial justice, ecological ethics, ecumenical dialogue, and peace studies. She has co-authored and co-edited several volumes and is also a founder and resident of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community in South Bend, Indiana. Dr. File, we are all ears. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon. Buongiorno. It's a great blessing to be with you here on pilgrimage, remembering Dorothy Day together during this Jubilee Year of Hope. And as we begin, I'm reminded of Pope Francis's exhortation to us for this year, quote, "Through perennial presence in the life of the Pilgrim Church, the Holy Spirit illumines all believers with the light of hope. He keeps that light burning like an ever-burning lamp to sustain and invigorate our lives. Christian hope does not deceive or disappoint because it is grounded in the certainty that nothing and no one may ever separate us from God's love," unquote. People on a pilgrim journey listen for the Holy Spirit and pray for the grace to respond humbly. They are open to the purifying fire of God's love transforming them. They drink deeply of God's love in the present moment, surrendering to God step by step. They know that the proximate end of their physical journey is always situated against the larger horizon, the ultimate telos of life in God. Pilgrims are people of hope. Dorothy Day came to embody these pilgrim practices through the course of her life. She titled her regular Catholic Worker newspaper column On Pilgrimage, orienting her colorful accounts of the gritty stuff of daily life in the Catholic worker community against an eschatological horizon, pointing her readers toward God through vivid, fine-grained portraits of particular encounters in the moment, much as a sacramental sign draws us in ritually and also leads beyond itself through grace. Dorothy's pilgrim journey passed through various seasons of her life, and I'd like to focus on three in particular. First, her introduction to the awesome beauty of the material world through her partner Forster. And secondly, the birth of her daughter Tamar as an enfleshed experience of God's love, drawing her to baptism and Eucharistic communion. And finally, her contemplative correlation of Scripture and the Word made flesh in Jesus with the simultaneous pain and joy of God's interconnected creation, at once beautiful and groaning. Long before Leonardo Boff and Pope Francis popularized the phrase, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, Dorothy invited her community and readers to contemplate the interrelationship of all God's creation, as well as the devastating effects of human hubris in a nuclear age on the most vulnerable forms of life. So first, the beauty of the material world. The world will be saved by beauty. Dorothy frequently invoked this insight from Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, and it is still held dear by the Catholic worker movement writ large. Over the long arc of her pilgrim journey, it seems that Dorothy's deepening sacramental understanding of God's creation drew her ever further into the beautiful mystery of God's love in its myriad variety. Speaking at the Eucharistic Congress in 1976 in Philadelphia, she took an introspective look back over her spiritual life, identifying the beginning of her conversion with awakened awareness of the beauty and grace of the material world. Quote, "My conversion began many years ago at a time when the material world around me began to speak in my heart of the love of God." There is a beautiful passage in St. Augustine, whose Confessions I read at this time. "What is it I love when I love thee?" it begins, and goes on to list all the material beauty and enjoyment to be found in the life of the senses. The sea which surrounded us, rather, it was a bay leading out to the sea, provided food, fish, and shellfish in abundance, even the seaweeds, which a Japanese friend told me were part of the food of her people. Our garden grew vegetables, the fields berries, the trees fruits. Everything spoke to me of a creator who satisfied all our hungers. It was also the physical aspect of the church which attracted me: bread and wine, water, incense, the sound of waves and wind, all nature cried out to me," unquote. God's love drew her to God's self in and through the beauty of creation, and she credited Forster with introducing her to these wonders of the material world. Quote, "His enthusiasms were such that I could not help but be fascinated by the new world of nature he opened up to me, and I shared in his joys, except that of fishing," unquote. Even before she entered the church, she readily intuited and began to identify God's love as the source of all the natural beauty surrounding them as they made their life together on Staten Island in the simple abundance of God's provision. With a contemplative gaze, she writes of the easy rhythm of life attuned to nature in community with her neighbors on the beach. Quote, "Late in the afternoon, the wind dropped, the door of Lefty's shack stood open, and he sat there contemplating the sunset. The waves lapped the shore, tinkling among the shells and pebbles, and there was an acrid odor of smoke in the air. Down the beach, the Belgians were working, loading rock into a small cart, which looked like a tumbrel, drawn by a bony horse. They stopped as though in prayer, outlined against this brilliant sky, and as I watched, the chapel bell at St. Joseph's rang the Angelus. I found myself praying with thanksgiving, praying with open eyes, while I watched the workers on the beach and the sunset, and listened to the sound of the waves and the scream of the snowy gulls," unquote. Praying with open eyes. Dorothy drank deeply of the beauty of God's creation as a spiritual wellspring. Spiritually, God draws us close through those we love. Sister Helen Prejean, during a recent visit to Notre Dame, attributed this inexorable divine luring to the graced work of sneaky Jesus, a term Dorothy might have embraced. Forster and Dorothy were in love, and that love deepened amidst the lavishly gratuitous gifts of creation. But with the honesty of a contemplative, Dorothy names the painful paradox at the heart of their love, quote, "The very love of nature and the study of her secrets, which was bringing me to faith, cut Forster off from religion. His ardent love of creation brought me to the creator of all things. But when I cried out to him, 'How can there be no God when there are all these beautiful things?' he turned from me uneasily," unquote. Still, Dorothy held to her own clarity of truth and conscience, writing, quote, "God is the creator, and the very fact that we were begetting a child made me have a sense that we were made in the image and likeness of God, co-creators with him," unquote. 1 Corinthians 3:9 speaks of the human vocation to become synergoi, or cooperators with God. Dorothy's sacramental sensibility allowed her to live into that vision of graced cooperation, even as it meant diverging on a pilgrim path apart from Forster's journey. Such humility. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, observed that humility is an antidote to despair, and it is almost the same as integrity. Humility asks each of us, who are you really at the center before God? Humility springs from the ground of one's being, as its etymological root, humus, suggests. Is God the grounding center of my being? Dorothy, finding God everywhere, gave a resounding yes with deep integrity, knowing that it would mean separation from the man she loved. Spiritually, I think sneaky Jesus sustained Dorothy through this purifying stretch of the journey by walking with her, as he did with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. This calls to mind a homily Pope Francis preached on this Lucan gospel text on 26 April 2020, a few months before promulgating Fratelli Tutti. He noted that Jesus came alongside the two disciples as a pilgrim companion and met them as they were, brokenhearted and grieving. Quote, "There is an ancient rule of pilgrims which says that the true pilgrim should go at the pace of the slowest person. And Jesus is capable of this. He does it. He does not speed up. He waits for us to take the first step," unquote. Dorothy took that first step through loving God's creation and cooperating with God's ongoing creative energy, culminating in the birth of her daughter Tamar. And Jesus was with her every step. So, part 2, birth of Tamar, the sacramentality of a whole love. Dorothy's granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, who's right here with us, remembers that she, quote, "rarely could write of the beach without thinking of Tamar's conception and birth, and of happy cold spring days caulking a boat with Forster and collecting driftwood while watching the wind rise," unquote. Of Tamar's birth, Dorothy wrote, quote, "The very word deligo, the Latin word used for love, means I prefer. It was all very well to love God and his works in the beauty of his creation, which was crowned for me by the birth of my child. Forster had made the physical world come alive for me, and it had awakened in my heart a flood of gratitude. The final object of this love and gratitude was God. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the need to worship, to adore. It may have been an unthinking, unquestioning faith, and yet the chance certainly came again and again. Do I prefer the church to my own will? Even if it was only the small matter of sitting at home on a Sunday morning with the papers. And the choice was the church," unquote. The wholeness, the integrity of God's love drew her to the sacramental life of the church as the hermeneutical key for her pilgrim journey. Quote, "Through a whole love, both physical and spiritual," she wrote in The Long Loneliness, "I came to know God," unquote. In her June 1956 Catholic Worker newspaper article entitled Creation, she uses this lens of sacramental wholeness encompassing all of creation to set up what theologian Edward Skilebix called a contrast experience, an awareness of beauty and joy contrasted against the background of devastation and suffering, so acute as to sharpen their intensity. She wrote, quote, "Americans are reaching for the moon now, and our planes climb to unbelievable heights. And it is not just a desire to seek the womb to return to the earth when we say that it is necessary as never before for man, for all people, to kiss the earth from which we spring, and which has been so ennobled by Christ who took on our humanity. Man must become humble and know that it is God who created him and all the beauty around him. In the midst of this beauty, yesterday on Pentecost, the hydrogen bomb was dropped from the air over a Pacific island. The flash was equal to 500 suns, and according to one reporter, it was like a nightmare in broad daylight. The contest between man and God, it was as though man were trying to shut off the earth from heaven, from God himself," unquote. Pentecost happened to be Dorothy's favorite feast, the day of her confirmation, when she wrote about feeling indeed the Holy Spirit. That sacramental lens helped her name the existential danger at hand with eyes wide open, and it led her once again to praise God the Creator. Kissing the earth, the humus, became for her a sacramental reminder of human creatureliness, called to cooperate with God the Creator rather than worship idols of our own making, to surrender to the Holy Spirit's flame of love rather than glory in the hydrogen bomb's flash. Dorothy leaned into humility as a spiritual weapon against hubris, and she taught her grandchildren to do the same through embodied practice, as Kate Hennessy recalls, quote, "It was after a long stay at the beach that Dorothy wrote, 'We need reverence for the earth. Everything comes from the earth. Alyosha and the brothers Karamazov kissed the earth. I took my grandchildren out one day at the Peter Marin farm and said, 'Come on out and let's kiss the earth.' Such a strange, mysterious, and beautiful concept, man being part of the earth," unquote. At the heart of Dorothy's daily rhythm of life, weaving together contemplation and action, was the Eucharistic liturgy. She drew sustenance from the Eucharistic elements of the earth, bread and wine, becoming Jesus' flesh for the life of the world. Returning to that same article, Creation, she wrote there about Eucharistic remembrance standing in stark contrast to human hubris. Quote, "And we need to remind ourselves that the reason for man's existence is to love, honor, and serve God, that the greatest work of the day is the Mass, the offering of the God-man to God for his praise, honor, and glory, in reparation for our sins and in thanksgiving for all his benefits, and that the Mass is not to help the work of the day, which it does, of course, but that all the work of the day is to build up to the climax of the Mass, that act of love, that moment of union with God. When we use the Mass to further our work, which we regard of such importance, and which we need as human beings to regard as of great importance, it is as though we were walking upside down on our heads. We need to stop and right ourselves every now and then, frequently at first, until we get in the habit of walking upright," unquote. Through Dorothy's faithful embodied practice, Eucharistic liturgy shaped the incarnational spirituality of the whole Catholic worker movement. Frequent return to the phrase, "the world will be saved by beauty," has become a form of ascesis, a disciplined attention to that of God precisely where and when God's creation is desecrated, broken, and vulnerable. She wrote in her diary on Easter Sunday, March 26, 1978, quote, "The Easter feast, joy goes on. Our houses of hospitality may be filled with desolation, and yet joy is still here. Some of the volunteers and staff visited the hospitals where we have patients, Mother Cabrini, Bellevue, Manhattan State, etc. Somehow sharing in the suffering of others lightens the sorrow of the world. Sorrow and the joy of this season, which lightens that sorrow. Again, beauty will save the world," unquote. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence of ecological desecration all around her beloved Staten Island beach, with eyes wide open, she practiced the spiritual discipline of finding beauty. Kate Hennessy writes, quote, "Dorothy's relationship with the land was not as a farmer or gardener like Tamar. It was more as spiritual sustenance, as an instinctive awareness of what John Moriarty, the Irish philosopher and guardian of the Irish landscape and its mythologies, called the integrity of the land, no matter what abuse it endures. And Staten Island had endured much," unquote. Contemplating the fresh kills garbage dump, industrial pollution, and the detritus of a throwaway culture continuously washed up along the beach, Dorothy, with eyes wide open, steadfastly connected the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor, practicing what she advised in her creation article, that is, meeting human hubris with the spiritual ascesis of humility. Even the hydrogen bomb was not powerful enough to quench the fire of God's love evident everywhere. In a May 1974 column entitled "Holy Fools," She concludes with a reflection from Teilhard de Chardin, quote, "Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then for the second time in the history of the world, man will discover fire," unquote. Along her pilgrim path, Dorothy honed an extraordinary spiritual capacity to focus the fiery energy of God's love where it was most needed, whether a person at the door needing to be recognized as a human being created imago Dei, or in calling the U.S. to repent for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Jesus' incarnation sanctified a material world despite all sinful efforts to destroy it. Even in its degradation, all creation sacramentally signifies the infinite energy of God's love. With eyes wide open, Dorothy perceived the path of the Holy Fool as a pilgrim journey of living into the divinization of all creation. And so finally, singing joyfully to the Lord. Following a heart attack in September 1976, Dorothy acknowledged in the October-November issue of the newspaper, quote, "Since I have been forbidden speaking and traveling by my doctor, the column this month is a pilgrimage of another sort," unquote. What called her attention in prayer were the old breviary's Psalms of Rejoicing on Thursday, inviting Eucharistic remembrance of Christ's gift of himself in bread and wine in the Last Supper as sustenance for the journey. Her meditation on Psalm 96 reminded her once again of her joy in nature that drew her to God and the church. Quote, "Sing joyfully to the Lord, all you lands. Break into song. Sing praise. Let the sea and what fills it resound, the world and those who dwell in it. Let the rivers clap their hands, the mountains with them for joy," unquote. As she came near the end of her pilgrim journey, Dorothy's diary is replete with scriptural refrains punctuating her wonder at God's gifts of creation, almost in the form of call and response, the fruit of lifelong prayer with scripture. On June 15th, 1977, she contemplated a verse from the book of Daniel, which should sound familiar to us these days as we're reading Daniel in the Mass. Quote, "All ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord. Singing to John as a baby, a beautiful bird, a mockingbird, singing away, praise him. Waves pounding on the beach, huge swell, waters of Raritan Bay, sea and sky meet on this humid day. Damp gets in your bones," unquote. At the end of that summer day on September 8th, at the end of that same summer on September 8th, she recalled Philippians 4:4 at daybreak. Quote, "A beautiful sunrise, gulls on the big rock offshore, low tide. Sometimes one wakes depressed in September, problems on every side. One cannot help but share them, the human condition." St. Paul wrote, "Rejoice, again I say rejoice. Work, clean a room, a desk, clean oneself up," unquote. Simultaneously cleaning and rejoicing, even in the midst of spiritual struggle, captures well the incarnational spirituality that Dorothy embodied. Making her way on pilgrimage, she created space for countless others to join her as pilgrims of hope, holy fools for Christ, who rejoice in the sacramental goodness of God's creation and allow it to sustain our yes to God's invitation to love in the ways most needed, with eyes wide open. Thank you.
We're very grateful to Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who has kindly sent a greeting to us, and we would like to invite you to listen to his brief greeting before beginning the second part.
Hi everybody, Cardinal Timothy Dolan here, coming to you from right behind St. Patrick's Cathedral. I was thrilled when I heard that there's a symposium on Dorothy Day in the Eternal City, the city of Peter and Paul in Rome. And I'm delighted to greet all of you. I wish I could be there with you. This is appropriate because Dorothy Day, yeah, we're really proud of her here in the Archdiocese of New York. She was one of us. She walked our streets. She worshiped in our churches. She tended for the poor and advocated for peace and justice here in New York. But she belongs to the world. Dorothy Day belongs to the world. She belongs to the Church Universal. And we look for the day when the Church Universal can recognize that by beatifying her, the first step towards canonization. Thanks for doing it, everybody.
So yes, she does belong to the world. So good afternoon and welcome to the second panel of our academic symposium on the legacy of Dorothy Day. In the next hour, we will be enlightened by Professor Kevin Ahern and Professor Diego Alonso Laceras on her social action. I guess you think you know the story. You don't. The real one's much more gory. Roald Dahl's opening of Cinderella is a perfect introduction to Dorothy Day's legacy, if we change gory with holy. There are so many insights on social action that Dorothy Day leaves us today. To give some examples, the role of information. If information is not accessible to all, it fails in its nature and freedom. The role of literature. Who we are also depends on what we imagine. The difference between justice and care. Dorothy Day's Pilgrimage is a crucial reflection on this, a reflection of disconcerting relevance today. Moreover, she reminds us the need to keep asking ourselves what the Church's priorities are today, and so as members of the Church, which are ours. Dorothy Day reminds us the need to continue fighting misogyny in the Church. She wrote in the 60s, "Women are no longer accepting their lack of status in the Church." Well, where are we now? In Rome, she has the feeling of not being listened to, the impression that the Church is not so interested in lay women. Again, where are we now? This year, we recalled a lot of important historical anniversaries, among them the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as we heard before. Well, how is memory made? Winners, all the winners, hold the enormous power to shape historical account and the memory of events. And a false memory means a false present, and therefore a future with a false hope. Dorothy Day has a lot to say on this as well. So, in order to try to live the gospel here in this world, in order to try to be fully Christians and fully citizens, let's embrace Day's legacy. When I went to Mary House in New York, I asked to see her room, the room where Dorothy wrote, prayed, loved, where she died. The answer was, well, we have to ask Jack, or whatever was the name of the man who was sleeping there. This answer is Dorothy Day. If we wish, at least I wish, Dorothy Day to be a saint, not a holy card, she will not be only an American saint. So let's make this woman read and experienced by non-Americans as well. You can't understand Dorothy Day, her social action, if you don't understand the Catholic worker, whose roots stretch on both sides of the ocean. And it's Dorothy Day that frequently reminds us that Peter Moran is much more than a funny old man with a strong accent. So, going back to the other side of the Atlantic, please welcome Professor Kevin Ahern, is a theological ethicist and professor of religious studies at Manhattan University, where he directs the Dorothy Day Center for Social Catholicism. He has published several books and is the past president of 2 international lay movements. Professor Ahern serves as the board chair of the Guild for the Canonization of Dorothy Day.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here at the Gregorian. Thank you to our hosts here for welcoming us. One of our hopes with this symposium is to get students in the room. And I'm so happy to see many students from different countries here. And following on what Julia was just saying, I hope this is an invitation for us to see more research on what Dorothy might mean to your own context outside the United States. So we hope that we can see some research done on that, on Dorothy and her legacy. So I want to talk this afternoon about what it means for Dorothy's legacy in relation to the development of the Church's witness against nuclear weapons, but also the Church's witness on pacifism. 60 years ago, on November 4th, 1965, a dramatic scene unfolded in Union Square. On stage, 5 young men, including Thomas Cornell of the New York Catholic Worker, whose 2 children join us today, and one of his grandchildren, burned their draft cards in an illegal act of resistance to the Vietnam War. Among those supporting the young men that day was Dorothy Day. In her speech, she denounced, quote, the immorality of war, and then she reminded the crowd that Jesus commanded us to, quote, love our enemies, not to take the lives of men, women, and children, young and old, by bombs and napalm and all of the other instruments of war, end quote. This protest came only weeks after Dorothy's own act of nonviolent resistance here in Rome. In October 1965, she joined a group of women in a 10-day fast, praying that the Second Vatican Council would condemn nuclear weapons. Dorothy arrived in Rome with special issues of her Catholic Worker paper that she printed for that purpose to distribute amongst the Council Fathers, and met with a number of them during her time here. On October 8th, Bishop Pierre Bollin of Verdun, France, drew attention to the group of women in the deliberations on Schema 13. In December, Dorothy wrote of her joy in hearing the, quote, happy news that her prayers were answered with paragraph 80 of Gaudium et Spes, which condemned, quote, any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities as a crime against God and man, God's self. Right? Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities. We might think about that in other contexts today. 6 decades later, the Catholic doctrine on war has continued to develop, moving away from a nearly exclusive position adhering to just war to what scholars and activists today describe as just peace. In his World Day of Peace messages and in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis not only advanced a more cautious position to war, but also offered the most explicit endorsement of gospel nonviolence. While this development certainly validates Dorothy's own readings of the gospel, can we discern anything more? Did this peace activist and grandmother actually help to advance Catholic doctrine on war? In other words, did Dorothy, in both style and substance, contribute to what Gordon Zahn described at one point as Catholic social thought from below, changing this doctrine from below? Dorothy's impact on Catholic social teaching owes much to her distinctive style. In her book, Prophetic in Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, Kristen Heyer, who's a professor at Boston College, distinguishes between 2 styles of Catholic social engagement. A public style employs the principles of Catholic social teaching as a basis for formal engagement with government officials and participation in conventional political channels. Examples here include letter writings to elected officials and the Church's engagement with the United Nations. The prophetic style, by contrast, works outside traditional structures to denounce injustice and challenge those in positions of power through direct action and moral witness. Examples here include actions of civil disobedience, like the picture here of Dorothy's last arrest with the farm workers in California. Dorothy Day embodied this prophetic approach, often in ways that put her at odds with both the institutional church and government officials. Many church leaders in the Archdiocese of New York simply did not know what to do with this exceptional woman whose approach to the works of mercy earned her a place on the FBI's list of most dangerous radicals. Day's rejection of war predated her 1926 conversion to Catholicism. After her conversion, she sought to synthesize her social commitments with her newfound faith. Central to this synthesis were the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, the lives of the saint, which we heard about earlier, and the emergent theology of the mystical body of Christ as advanced by the Jesuit Emile Mersch in the wake of the First World War, and later articulated by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical During the Horrors of the Second. When Dorothy and Peter launched the Catholic Worker in 1933, pacifism was not the immediate focus. Within a few months, however, the paper soon took stances opposing class warfare and both sides of the Spanish Civil War. As World War II loomed, Dorothy wrote several articles reaffirming her pacifist position. In June 1940, she addressed the question, quote, what if we are invaded? And she responded by saying, we say again that we are opposed to all but the use of nonviolent means to resist such an invader. She confronted this issue more directly in her January 1942 editorial after Pearl Harbor. Quote, we are still pacifists. Our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, which means that we will try to be peacemakers. Speaking for our many conscientious objectors, we will not participate in armed warfare or making munitions or by buying government bonds to prosecute the war or by urging others to do so in this effort. This stance cost the Catholic Worker dearly in subscriptions and in some committed members leaving. As World War II concluded, Dorothy's prophetic stance took on a new urgency with the advent of nuclear weapons. Her September 1945 editorial, which we have celebrated that anniversary this year, offered a scathing critique of the atomic bomb and President Truman, making her one of the first prominent Catholic voices to oppose the new weapons. This was not abstract moralizing. Dorothy understood that nuclear weapons represented a qualitatively different kind of violence, one that threatened not just combatants, but all of humanity and creation itself. In the 1950s, her opposition moved from words to action through civil disobedience. On June 15, 1955, 29 pacifists, including Dorothy Day and Eamon Hennessy of the Catholic Worker, were arrested in City Hall Park for defying mandatory civil defense drills. Over the next 6 years, Day would be arrested 4 more times, serving a total of 45 days in jail. While many bishops in the United States were focused more on the threats of atheistic communism, these actions raised consciousness about the immorality of nuclear weapons and the dangers of normalizing the preparations for nuclear war. By 1961, thousands joined in these protests and the drills were quietly discontinued. The publication of Pacem in Terris in 1963 inspired Dorothy that year a lot, and later that year she joined a peace pilgrimage to Rome to thank the Pope for his letter, and to ask the Pope that he have a more explicit condemnation of nuclear weapons, an effort that she would build upon 2 years later during her fast at the Council's final session. Dorothy's prophetic witness continued into the 70s, despite her declining health. In 1976, at the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, speaking alongside Mother Teresa, Dorothy criticized the organizers for scheduling a mass that day for the armed forces on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. In what would be her last public address, she drew attention to the profound links between the Eucharist and peace. So what, if any impact did any of this have on the development of social doctrine, on the church itself? Looking back, Dorothy's legacy in shaping official Catholic social teaching from below, even if indirect, can be seen in 2 areas. First, Dorothy helped to establish that faithful Catholics could legitimately adopt pacifism, including as conscientious objectors to military service. This has been promoted not only by the Catholic Worker movement, but also with other movements associated with Dorothy, Pax Christi USA, and the Catholic Peace Fellowship. When Day founded the Catholic Worker in 1933, this position was far from clear. The Church's teaching on just war and obedience to the state were much better known than its tradition on nonviolence and the primacy of conscience. Bishops like Cardinal Spellman of New York championed efforts to resist communism and were very reluctant to support young Catholic men as conscientious objectors to the war in Vietnam. Following Vatican II, the U.S. Catholic bishops affirmed the value of nonviolence in one of the first times it appears in a magisterial statement in their 1983 pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. In drafting the text, an example of the Church's public style, right, the public versus prophetic, the U.S. Catholic bishops consulted Thomas Cornell, one of those draft card burners, and taught that pacifism was one of two morally legitimate positions for Catholics to take, alongside just war teaching. Significantly, the bishops named Dorothy Day alongside Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. as, quote, having a profound impact on the life of the Church in the United States through a renewed attention to nonviolence. More recently, Day's influence can be seen in the 2016 Nonviolence and Just Peace Conference, organized here in Rome by Pax Christi International. The conference echoed many of the themes from Dorothy's life, and its final statement drew attention to the value of gospel nonviolence and called the Church to move from a just war framework to a just peace tradition. I think some of you might cover this in some of your classes, potentially. While he did not go as far as to reject just war, Pope Francis clearly echoed the final statement in his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Nonviolence, a style of politics for peace, and later in Fratelli Tutti, where he taught that it is very difficult nowadays to speak of the possibility of a just war. In these developments, Day appears less as a radical outlier than a forerunner. Second, Dorothy's legacy challenges the Church to take seriously the movement for nuclear abolition. This effort has gained new momentum with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was supported and ratified by the Holy See, and with the strong support by Pope Francis, whose forceful teaching on the immorality of both the use and the possession of nuclear weapons is made clear in Fratelli Tutti. A leading voice in this effort has been Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In his 2022 pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, Wester cites Day and includes her in a list of suggested readings, and he has spoken about being inspired by her in memorial masses in New York, organized alongside UN meetings for the Treaty of the UN. Among the most striking efforts to channel Day's legacy in opposition to nuclear weapons has been the Plowshares movement, initiated by Jesuit Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip Berrigan in 1980 to draw attention to nuclear weapons through acts of disarmament. While it is debatable if Day would have supported the limited destruction of property that characterizes the typical Plowshares action, the movement builds upon Dorothy's pacifist positions and her prophetic style of non-cooperation with the works of war. In the most recent Plowshare actions, one of Dorothy's granddaughters, Martha Hennessy, who is here with us today, joined 6 other activists in entering the Kings Bay submarine base on April 4th, 2018, to, quote, make real the prophet Isaiah's command to beat swords into plowshares. Like her grandmother in the civil defense drills, Martha believed that her conscience compelled her to defy the law, hoping that her trial and imprisonment might raise awareness to the destructive power of Trident nuclear submarines. In Gaudete and Exsultate, Pope Francis defined holiness in light of the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes he taught are like a Christian's identity card. But practicing them, following Jesus, is not easy, and often involves what Francis says as going against the flow. We live in a moment of escalating nuclear danger in a world marked by both indifference and interdependence. Russia and the United States have suspended participation in nuclear arms control treaties. China is expanding its nuclear arsenal, and the United States is considering restarting testing. Dorothy Day's prophetic witness on nonviolence and nuclear abolition challenges people of faith to go against the flow, to refuse the normalization of nuclear deterrence, to resist the silence that surrounds these weapons of mass destruction, and to insist that the possession of nuclear weapons is incompatible with the gospel. As her cause for canonization advances, perhaps the church will finally receive the full force of her prophetic message, that in the nuclear age, pacifism is not a naive idealism, but a clear-eyed realism about what our weapons can do and what our faith demands us to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahern, for your presentation, reminding us of these aspects, urgent and incompatible with the gospel, about this woman, this peace activist, and this grandmother. Pointing out, I think it's very important, some concrete things that we can do. Dorothy Day has a lot to say on this as well. And please, now, coming back to this side of the ocean, please welcome Professor Diego Alonso Las Heras, who gioca in casa, because he is a professor here at the Gregorian University. He teaches moral theology and courses on social ethics, specifically on religious freedom and the role of the church in the international order. As a priest, he also develops some pastoral activities.
Thank you. You said che gioco in casa. I play in my own field. But I'm the only one who is not a native English speaker. I'm not an expert in Dorothy Day, so you will forgive me for my shortcomings. Okay. In his first apostolic exhortation, Pope Leo insists, which we had a month and a half ago, insists, quote, Christians come to appreciate the close connection between Christ's love and his summons to care for the poor, end quote. He further asserts that, quote, it is essential to insist on this path to holiness, for it in this call to recognize him in the poor and the suffering, we see revealed the very heart of Christ, his deepest feeling and choices, which every saint seeks to imitate, end quote. The last part of this quote, the Pope is quoting Pope Francis on Gaudete and Exsultate that you quoted. So the last two popes insist that, holiness has to do essentially with love and care of the poor. And Benedict XVI, in the conclusion of his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, he ended up the encyclical by citing the example of, quote, human promotion and Christian formation intended above all for the poorest, which was first taken up by the monastic and mendicant orders, and then by the various male and female religious institutes throughout the history of the Church. Figures such as Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola, John of God, Camillus de Lelis, Vincent de Paul, Luis de Marillac, Joseph Carolengo, John Bosco, Luigi Orione, and Teresa of Calcutta remain outstanding models of social charity. I find it revealing that, at this beginning of the 21st century, all the popes have thought that it's important to insist that one trait of holiness it is to care for the poor, which is something, we've heard all the experts so far, so it's certainly something also very central to Dorothy Day's life. But I also think that Dorothy Day's life not only shows this care for the poor, but also unveils something which is important for Catholic social teaching. I do moral theology, social ethics, Catholic social teaching, and I think her life, like the lives of many saints, canonized or not, shows something important, which is what I'm going to develop here. Hans Urs von Balthasar, in a text on Thérèse de Lisieux, and we've heard that she was a favorite of Dorothy Day, and Elizabeth of Dijon, less known, but another Carmelite more or less of the same time. He affirms that holiness is something, Balthasar says, essentially social. And it is social because holiness is not a special gift from God to one person, to the person who receives that holiness, but a gift to the whole body that is the church. Especially in those cases, using von Balthasar's terminology, in which holiness is a particular holiness, opposed or to and not habitual holiness. You know, there are saints who are habitual holiness. We cross their ways with them, thank God, every day, and they will never be canonized, but are holy people. But in case of particular holiness, he says their lives, and I would argue that this is certainly true in Dorothy Day's life, her lives present themselves as, he uses the word, a spectacle. And he says, I don't mean that in a theatrical or a cinematic representation, but in the etymological sense of the word, as something to be looked at. The life of every saint, canonized or not, is something that presents itself to be looked at, to be contemplated. And there are, and here I quote from Balthasar, examples of holiness which God himself sets as a milestone, as a distinctive sign, as valid explanatory models of his gospel for today, and sometimes perhaps even for future centuries, end quote. I would argue that this is the case with Dorothy Day and the entire movement that she basically, along with Peter Morin, began, whose life is an explanatory model of how to live the gospel and care for the poor by creating, participating, and living in structures of grace, because poverty is always the result of structures of misery, of structures of sin. Human misery is not just a fatality. Human misery, and in the recent apostolic exhortation, the Pope repeated this idea. We have poor people not because some of us are born blonde and some of us are born with dark hair. No, we have poverty and we have misery because we have sin in the world. And I think, Dorothy Day's life helps us understand something about it, and it enriches the teaching and could, Professor Weil, you said that she anticipated Laudato Si by years. I would argue that she is an example of what I call, and Professor Ahern has a book about it, structures of grace. She anticipated also the idea of structures of sin and the opposing structures of grace. The concept of structures of sin entered the Catholic social teaching in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis with John Paul II in 1987. He said that these structures of sin are the sum of negative factors which act contrary to a true awareness of the universal common good and the need to promote it, creating in individuals and institutions an obstacle that it's difficult to overcome. This concept has really had, in circles of Catholic social teaching, a good reception. You do a Catholic social teaching 101 course, and they will talk to you about this concept. I think it also has allowed us to welcome it because it helps Catholic conscience take into account the social dimension of all moral action. Catholic moral theology has been, I would argue, rightly accused of being too individualistic. You know, when you go to confessions, you confess individual sins. You usually don't confess social sins. And certainly, I find it kind of interesting that Dorothy Day, again, is an example of someone, you know, ahead of her time, trying to, with her life and her sacramental practice, going beyond this kind of moral individualism, partly because through the doctrine which she uses. I mean, she names it a lot and takes the consequence of the body of Christ. I mean, it's kind of one of these constant themes. But I believe the encyclical, I mean, not the encyclical, the reception of the encyclical has remained half of the way. Why? Because we talk a lot about structures of sin. It's good to talk about structures of sin, but Jesus Christ did not send his apostles to preach the gospel of sin and condemnation. Jesus Christ sent his apostles to preach the gospel of grace and salvation. And therefore, I would argue that there's a book by Professor Ahern that said, but one concept that in Catholic social teaching, that in Catholic ethics, we have to develop more is the idea of structures of grace, structures of grace. And what I argue today here is that I think Dorothy Day's life and the Catholic worker movement offers an example of how this can be done and how this is done. It's a spectacle in the sense that von Balthasar used it, in the sense. So the reception of structures of sin is unsatisfactory. It's good, it's not bad, but I would argue it's unsatisfactory because we have to receive it, but not stay there. I would argue we have to talk about structures of grace more. Lumen Gentium said that the church is in Christ as a sacrament. And I would argue that ecclesial bodies of different kinds are called to be in Christ as a sacrament. And therefore, to confront with structures of grace the structures of sin that we find in this world, and of which sometimes we are part of. I mean, it's not something that is just out there of which we are pure and contaminated. I mean, structures of sin we are sometimes part of. And the church's response to it is structures of grace, structures of grace. I would argue, if you look for a definition of structure of grace, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time. So I propose a working definition that is basically crafted as a photographic negative of what John Paul II says about structures of sin. So the sum of social relations infused with grace, which allow individual Christians and ecclesial bodies a true awareness of the universal common good and the need to promote it, creating in these individuals and institutions a new light and consciousness of the need of conversion and church reform. These structures are based on personal and communal experience of grace and therefore help individuals and communities to live more fully the gospel. I would argue, following also part of the book of Professor Ahern, that this happens at least in 4 ways. I guess we could always have more, but I mean, the first one is simple life according to the gospel, which we could term as, Christian witness. This person lives the gospel. So that's the first way in which we partake in structures of grace. The second way that structure of grace works is in a pedagogical way, by preaching in a certain particular way, teaching others with whom they come in contact how to live according to the gospel. And it's been said here, and it's very clear, I'm not an expert in Dorothy Day's writings and life, but reading what I've been able to read, that there are a number of people who are not Catholic workers, but spend some time in the Catholic work and receive this pedagogical influence. Third, by denouncing prophetically what is sinful and against the gospel, and particularly in her pacifism, Dorothy Day was very prophetical. And fourth, transforming social structures that become somehow infused with charity and with love. Okay, that would be structures of grace. Structures of grace, I would say, always are, in a certain way, imply church reform. We, as Christians, are not living up to our baptismal call. And I mean, this is true for all of us. It's not pointing the finger to somebody else. It's just accepting that, we don't live the full our call in baptism. Something about church reform and how this shows up in Dorothy Day's life and the Catholic worker. In a very important book for Catholic theology by Yves Congar, he talks about true and false reforms in the church. And he mentions 4 conditions for reform in the church without a schism. Without a schism. The 4 conditions are the primacy of charity and pastoral care, remaining in communion with the whole, patient in respecting delays, and renewal is a return to the beginning of tradition, not to the tradition of some novelty by mechanical adaptation, but by finding in the tradition the sources to renew the church. So it's not just jump up in the last fashion, which we could always fall into that defect, but finding in what might be a sign of the time how we respond to this, drawing on our tradition. And the church has a long tradition. Okay, I would argue that these 4 conditions for reform without schism are exemplified in Dorothy Day's and the Catholic worker movement way of working and being a structure of grace. And the last part of what I have to say has to do with it. Well, first, certainly Dorothy Day had difficult beginnings with the church, to put it mildly. She was not unaware or innocent of certain failures of the church, or if you want to be, we're in Rome, so you have to be careful with what you say, of the children of the church, not of the church, of the children of the church. And she says, I felt at the time that religion would only impede my work. She was moved for social reform and the plight of the poor. And she says, I wanted to have nothing to do with the religion of those whom I saw all about me. I felt that I must turn from it as from a drug. I felt the need to be an opiate of the people and not a very attractive one. So I hardened my heart. So her first encountering the church, she talks also, for example, of how she says, it's good to have hospitals and all these things, but, maybe we should ask ourselves, why do workers have working conditions that make them end up in those hospitals instead of just, maybe there are certain things that could be fixed without having to get to the hospital. So she has this first encounter, which I think it helps illuminate why the way she lived and the way she wanted to live is somehow church reform. It's participating, creating, living a structure of grace that is church reform. That is church reform. She's also aware that by participating and being part of these structures of grace, things get to change. Maybe not dramatically, but things get to change. In the long loneliness, she says at the very end of part 2, and before she meets Peter Morin, so to speak, and begins the Catholic worker, she says, quote, "The years have passed and most of the legislation called by those workers is on the books now," because she's just come back from Washington, helping people who were basically asking for working conditions that today we think are just basically normal, but in those days it was something you had to fight for or picket for. She said, I wonder, quote, "I wonder how many realize just now how much they owe the hunger marchers who endure at fast and cold, who were like the Son of Man when he said, the foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." So she's aware that, by participating in these structures of grace, things change, and sometimes they do change for the better. Why I think that we can talk about Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker as structure of grace and church reform? Well, I guess it's very clear that the Catholic worker practices charity and pastoral care, and particularly through the works of mercy, So I won't stop there because I have limited time. But it's also interesting how pastoral care, the primacy of pastoral care seems to be part of the style, the way of acting. She describes Moring when she first met him, quote, "Peter made you feel a sense of his mission as soon as you met him. He did not begin by tearing down or by painting so intense a picture of misery and injustice that you burned to change the world. Instead, he aroused in you a sense of your own capacities for work, for accomplishment. He made you feel that you and all men had a great and generous heart with which to love God. If you once recognized this fact in yourself, you would expect to find it in others. The art of human contacts, Peter called it happily," end quote. So certainly a primacy of pastoral care. This is kind of a phrase that when I read it, I thought, we should use this in courses of pastoral care and counseling. The ideas of houses of hospitality quickly caught on, and I put these woodcuts because they're the first woodcuts that the Betum made for the Catholic worker. There were two pictures of the saints, but there were also a practice of the works of mercy. St. Catherine of Siena visiting the imprisoned, and St. John Bosco instructing the ignorant. And they realized that this was the way to give primacy to charity and pastoral care. Second condition for a true reform of the church, remaining united with the whole. We've just heard a lot about Dorothy Day's position on pacifism. But she remained united. She knew her position was not a majority position. I mean, she wasn't the only one, but it was clearly a minority position. And she respected very clearly, and I won't go on farther, this remaining united with the whole. Even though I'm sure she sometimes was kind of not very happy with the position of some of the pastors of the church. Patient and respect for the delays. Her biographers talk about she grew more patient. You quoted, that somebody's corrected her, said, you should tame your. She grew more patient. Maybe not enough, but even the saints could be patient. I like this phrase that I read in one of her biographies, that as she grew older, she started saying, somebody has to chop the vegetables, because in a Catholic worker house, or in Jesuit houses, for the same sake, somebody has to chop the vegetables, or, make sure that when you take the community car, you put gas after it. This just happens in Jesuit houses. I'm sure in other types of community, people leave always the car with the tank full. The last condition that, reading her life, I find happens is renewal happens through a return to the principle of tradition. So in Peter Morin's way of thinking and in Dorothy Day's and the Catholic worker, I find a lot of resonances with the liturgical movement. I mean, I don't think Peter Morin is a member of the liturgical movement, but I don't know if he received the influence or just resonated. I don't know, I'm not an expert in the life of Morin, but certainly in this idea that, the sacramental is the social and the social is the sacramental, it resonates a lot, I would say, with Dorothy Day's life, which on the other hand, it's basically, I teach Catholic Social Ethics 101. I would argue that that's basically what the fathers of the church say. I mean, if I had to say, like in a line, what do the fathers of the church say about, social ethics? The sacramental is social and the social is sacramental. Now, this is not Dorothy Day, but another author says, and I like it, our social program is the Eucharist. Okay, I imagine that, if we had here Dorothy Day, she would more or less agree with this. To conclude, I would argue that, in Dorothy Day's life, the church finds a good example of how holiness goes along with beginning or participating in structures of grace, which at the same time are always a way of church reform. Structures of grace are, ecclesial or church bodies that try to bring the grace of God to a certain place and social place. It's also always part of church reform because the church always has to live to the full the calling that we have received in baptism.
Thank you, Professor Diego Alonso Lazaras, for your presentation. You gave us a lot of insights on holiness, canonized or not, on grace, on sin, social sin. That's very interesting. We have a lot of patience with the church. I think the mothers of the church have a lot of patience. And it was very interesting, the accent you put on the idea of community. That is very important. It's not being by oneself, but it's the idea of community. Really, thank you to both our professors, because when Pope Leo recalled Dorothy Day some days ago, he talked about a woman of mind, heart, and hands. Heart and hands is something that traditionally we put besides women. Mind is not so obvious. So what these two presentations demonstrate the richness of this part even of Dorothy Day's legacy.
Hello, my name is René Mikalev. I'm a Jesuit. I teach social ethics and fundamental moral theology here, and I'm honored to be with you and to present to you the granddaughters of Dorothy Day, who are with us for this last moment of our reflection, to speak about her legacy. I'll just say something biographical. So, to my right, Kate, is a writer and artist who is living in Ireland. She's the author of the book Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty. And she's a contributor to the London Tablet and the Catholic Worker newspaper. And to my right, Martha Hennessy, who is a retired occupational therapist. She volunteers at the Mary House Catholic Worker, and she's a peace activist. She also farms in Vermont and is the grandmother of 9. I don't know if you've coordinated who's not. She's going first, so so welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I really am so grateful to all of the people who have put this event together and made it possible. So thank you so much. I actually threw out my speech, and I apologize to the translators, but I just have decided that I need to say something very different than what I had prepared for today. So I apologize. It's a very rare occasion or situation to have living relatives of someone who's being considered for sainthood. So I'm very grateful that both Kate and I are able to be here with you. And what I really want to do is to share her with others, share her with you. And she did belong to the world, but she also belonged to her family. So I just want to share some stories about family life. When I was 3 years old, I remember sitting on Dorothy's lap. She was a very good storyteller, and she was either coming or going to our house. And I do believe that experience of having my ear on her chest, hearing the resonation of her voice and hearing her heartbeat, that for me was an incarnational experience of God. As a 3-year-old, I had this sense of the presence of God with that one tiny moment that's lodged in my memory. As an 8-year-old, I remember sitting at the dining room table and chewing on a pencil and wiggling and squirming and really wrestling with a poem I was writing, and it was called The Sun. And it was a poem about God. And Dorothy and Tamar, Granny and Ma, were in the kitchen, and I clearly remember their presence. I didn't grow up with my dad. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother, and the two of them were helping me to give birth to this poem. And then my mother printed it out with a hand print press. When I was 16, my sister Mary and I were visiting Dorothy at St. Joe's. She put us to work mopping and sweeping. At one point, she looked at me and said, "Martha, you need to be more like Mary," and I was crushed. Dorothy was right. She understood people's dispositions. She read their souls. And so that memory always stayed with me. What did she mean? I'm sweeping too rapidly. I'm thinking of being the Martha, and here I need to think about a contemplative life. And my last visit with her was when I was 24 years old. I was with my son, who was very active, and she just simply looked at me and said, "I'm too tired, take him out of here." And that was my last visit with her. So the works of mercy, living at Mary House I don't do it full time. I don't think I could survive. But I would describe life and work at Mary House as the agony and the ecstasy. The skills that we need at Mary House are, can you cook a lot of food? Can you be nice when you serve the food? And can you help clean up on a regular basis? That's pretty much the essence of the skills that we need at Mary House. And of course, I can't help but think about St. Paul saying, faith without works is meaningless. And so the houses of hospitality and the works of mercy are very concrete. And having a woman come in cold and dirty and giving her clean clothes, or having her pick out clean clothes, take a shower, and help herself to a warm cup of coffee to hold in her hands, that is very direct, that is very concrete, that is very practical. Is it bringing down the Pentagon or any of the other structural sins that we have in place? I don't know, but I do know that that is what we have to do, is to comfort those who are afflicted most immediately in front of us. And lastly, I would say what Dorothy has given me, you pay attention to the suffering of others, and you pray about what it is you need to do about that suffering. And so she taught me to resist the bomb. She handed me this book by John Hershey, Hiroshima. And so I did participate in an action. I am a convicted felon, and that was the most powerful component of my faith journey back to what is my baptism, what does my baptism mean? And of course, the coldness of our U.S. federal courts and the warmth of the inmates that I shared life with in Danbury were very clear to me and very much reinforced that I was in the right place doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the personal witness, and obviously it helps us complete the picture which we've had with the thought and also the action and the reflection on theological implications of the life and the action of Dorothy Day. But this gives us some vignettes which we can treasure as we leave. I'd like to introduce Kate Hennessy, who, again, I already introduced her, so writer and artist living in Ireland. Please welcome her, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. No, it's not on. Now it's on. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm kind of like a hanger-on, last-minute invitation. It is such a privilege to be asked to speak about my grandmother. I love talking about her. I prepared a talk, and I prepared a talk, and yet this topic is so emotional for me. I'm going to cry through it, so please forgive me as I do this. In this topic of Dorothy's legacy, there is much to examine, and she has been keeping many of us, historians, theologians, students, writers, thinkers, and of course, generations of Catholic workers, busy and engaged long after her death. She was a prolific writer, speaker, and thinker with a deep intellectual and cultural curiosity. She owned little and gave away much. She held such a spiritual richness and a nuanced, questioning, and profound faith that here we are 45 years after her death, still trying to understand her. Dorothy is still making us nervous, still challenging us, and here I stand after 50 years of trying to unpeel the layers of my understanding of who my grandmother was, not only to others, but to me. My awareness of my grandmother began as a child and a teenager with a slow awakening to her voice, her writings, her presence as both a grandmother and a public figure. I saw nothing unusual. She was simply who she was, our wonderful granny. And I saw nothing unusual in the Catholic worker, and what a fascinating and miraculous thing it was and continues to be. Chaos and love in action. I lost my grandmother when I was 20, at a time I was struggling to see if the Catholic worker was a place for me. And I began to follow my own path and live my own disasters, as my mother Tamar called them. Then after Tamar's death, and after decades of listening to her speak of her mother, trying to uncover her own layers of understanding, I found myself writing the story of Dorothy and Tamar as best as I could. And more layers began to reveal themselves to me. Even now, I can't claim to have a handle on it all, but I try to do my best. People often comment to me on how taken they are by Dorothy's love for the poor. I have never felt that this is an accurate representation of her life and work. The Catholic worker wasn't the poor. It was her family. It was her community. And its creation came from a deep recognition and response to the human condition and how we are all in need in one way or another. She said there's always some way we can be generous with one another, and to truly perceive one another in our humanness, our capacities, our sorrows and sufferings, not as observers or social workers, but as community. Dorothy challenges us in many ways, institutionally, economically, and politically. But most of all, she challenges us personally. She asks us to trust Christ when he says to love one another, our neighbors and our enemies, and to open our doors and our hearts to strangers in need. I think it would be an utter tragedy if those of us who lived privileged and protected lives choose to see Dorothy the saint as a way to comfort ourselves. And I have seen over the years many attempts to tame her, conform her, or, when that isn't possible, to dismiss or ignore her. Dorothy asks us to see the world's suffering and to not turn away and say, I can do nothing, it is too much for me. There is always work to be done, however small. In one of her more famous quotes, she said, we can throw our pebble in the pond and be confident that its ever-widening circle will reach around the world. We repeat, there is nothing we can do but love, and dear God, please enlarge our hearts to love each other, to love our neighbor, to love our enemy as our friend. After the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Dorothy wrote a powerful column in which she spoke of those who died in the bombing. Perhaps, she wrote, we will breathe their dust into our nostrils, feel them in the fog of New York on our faces, feel them in the rain in the hills of our farm. What an extraordinary way of understanding what it means to be part of the mystical body of Christ. That we are breathing in, no matter where we are in the world, physical suffering of unimaginable scope. We are breathing in the dust of our endless wars, of our bottomless stockpiles of arms and nuclear weapons from which huge profits are being made. We are breathing in the suffering of those we turn away from our doors, often with hatred and prejudice, who are the victims of this violence and who are fleeing the destruction of their homes, their communities, and their environments. We are breathing in the suffering from our relentless attack on our earth and all its beings. Yes, we breathe these in daily. As I gathered my thoughts for this talk, I felt such grief. I am still grieving for my grandmother and for my mother. What strength, what beauty lies within them both. And this grief seems to be intensifying as I grow older and as I peel away these layers of deepening understanding. People often want to hear something personal from us, her grandchildren. At this moment, there is nothing more deeply personal I can think of than to share my grief with you and my love. But I'm curious about this grief, for there is joy and wonder in it too. It is full of sustenance, truthfulness, and a mysterious richness. It is a privilege to feel such sorrow. How blessed I am to have witnessed and to still be witnessing the wonder that is the life of Dorothy Day, through her stories, her writing, and through the heart of her work, the Catholic worker, still drawing to itself the curious and the spiritually and physically hungry. Dorothy still speaks to us of what we long for. She speaks to our basic human desires for peace, justice, and community, led by the call of Christ to do the works of mercy, not only believing in a world where it is easier to be good, but acting as if that world already exists in the here and now. In this discussion of Dorothy's legacy, we can decide that we know who she is and define her under our terms. Or we can open ourselves up to the complex, contrary, paradoxical, and mysteriousness of her life in all of her fulsomeness, in all of her power. I believe that she insists on us making a simple choice. Do we open our hearts or do we close them? What does it take to have this revolution of the heart that Dorothy spoke of? I suggest that we all be terrified of what she is asking of us. to gaze clearly on what is in the here and now, to grasp faith and trust with all we have, even if it is by our bleeding fingertips, to face our fears, to face our hypocrisies, to face our deep sense of failure, to do the work however we are called to do it, and to live with loving kindness, generosity, hospitality, and a deep awareness of beauty. And above all, to let love guide us, as imperfect as we are in our capabilities for love. Love, that most mysterious force of all, that power that we all hold within us, and that is the one true connection with God. And yes, I feel grief in my love. We will all feel grief in our love as we open our hearts, for we will now know what we have and what we are in danger of losing. What a gift, what a task we all have before us. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your grief also, a very, very personal note, but also these challenges, these questions which, and I think which Dorothy would challenge us with the risk of making a radical figure something normal, something which becomes tamed in some way, or relevant for the 1960s, for that generation, and not longer relevant for us, is a risk. And so thank you for bringing home those final comments and those questions which we will hopefully take with us from this meeting. I'd like to thank everyone who was part of this event, our sponsors, our partners, so Dorothy Day Guild, Lay Center, Manhattan University, and Notre Dame Rome. Also our translators, the volunteers, the technicians, and everyone. Thank you very much for being here, for sharing this time with us. We thought of doing something which reminds us also of the hospitality of Dorothy Day. So we have a little reception, but it's not just here. So we are also offering a nice dinner for homeless persons this evening or another evening who will in some way be part of this event. I think this is what Dorothy Day would do. And we will have something simpler in order to also be in communion with them. It's again, a number of people here who are from the United States. We're preparing for Thanksgiving, and it's something which I think we all should give thanks. So there's something festive, but we're going to celebrate with soup, which I think would be what Dorothy would do, and some other things. So enjoy yourself, enjoy the little meal which we have prepared. And have a nice evening. Those who are leaving, enjoy. Those who are visiting, enjoy your time in Rome. Thank you.